morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of AngelList Confidential. It's a really exciting slate of programming here today. Some of the highlights include our institutional LP panel, and the day's going to close with a fireside chat with Avlok and Naval. That's going to be great content. This morning, I'm delighted to start with our quarterly State of Venture report. The quarterly State of Venture report was originally designed in the pandemic to help us understand internally what was happening in among the tens of thousands of startups that AngelList GPs have invested into. Originally, we were partnered with SVB. Following the recent unpleasantness, we have begun doing quarterly partnerships with data providers that we view as highly complementary to the kind of unmatched near-term startup valuation data that AngelList has access to. And this quarter's partner is Ramp. So I'm delighted to be joined today in our San Francisco headquarters by Ian Macomber, Head of Data Science and Analytics Engineering at Ramp.
Hey everyone, my name's Ian. Like Abe said, I lead Ramp's data team. Ramp is the ultimate financial platform for all businesses. And to Abe's point, if AngelList has sort of the bird's eye view of money going into startups, by virtue of the fact that Ramp has credit cards and account payable and reimbursements, we see how startups spend that money. And so all of the slides that we're going to give you today for the Ramp data are based on panel aggregated data of spend across these startups.
So we'll start from the AngelList side, talking about what we observed in this quarter. And although this slide doesn't necessarily make it clear, I think the overarching theme of the quarter is put the way a GP friend described it. This quarter was boba, not bubble tea, but bounce off the bottom autumn is the quip about what we saw in the third quarter of the year. This slide shows an encapsulation of, I think, one of the most important data points that we track, which is the positive activity rate. So every quarter we look at, among all of the startups, active startups that change their valuation, did the valuation go up or did it go down? This plot goes from the second quarter of 2021, so really kind of like the height of the pandemic kind of frenzy, and carries through to today. That red colored line at 73% shows that's the median pre-pandemic positive activity rate. So we saw, of course, is that during the pandemic, the rate really shot up, peaked at 90%. And then starting in the third quarter of last year, it has kind of stubbornly persisted to be below the median that we saw, 2019 and before. The reason that this plot is slightly misleading is positive activity rate isn't the only thing that defines the quality of venture activity that happened in the quarter. The other factor is the amount of activity, and what we saw, and the reason that the quarter is best described as boba is that we actually saw a large increase in venture activity over the third quarter relative to the second quarter. And in fact, it was one of our first increases in actually transaction volume that we observed in more than a year. So these plots show, the top plot there is showing the 4 things that can happen to a startup that changes its valuation in a quarter. The startup can be marked up, it can exit up, it can be marked down, or it can exit down. That's typically a complete wind down, but sometimes it's just a sale at a price that's below the last financing. The bottom plot shows activity rates, and as you can see, kind of there's a spike that happened over the last couple months in terms of activity, driving it up from what was a historic low last quarter. So again, boba, bounce off the bottom, autumn. This plot earned a little bit of derision on Twitter when we posted it, but I actually find it to be the most informative plot looking at venture activity and encapsulating venture activity. What it shows is on the x-axis the activity rate, so that's the fraction of companies that change their valuation in a quarter, and the y-axis is the positive activity rate, right? The fraction of companies for whom that valuation change was positive. We've done the work of labeling kind of the northeast corner of the plot as boom times, right? In boom times, you see a lot of activity and it's very positive. That was, for instance, the October 2021 dot in this plot. We've also labeled in the southwestern corner bad times. When times are bad, there aren't a lot of deals getting done, and the deals that are getting done are markdowns and company wind downs. So we actually, as you can see from the plot, really reached, from a quarterly perspective, the nadir of activity last quarter, in the second quarter. I think we billed it as sort of the worst quarter ever. Following that, activity in the third quarter rebounded a little bit. The positive activity rate did increase, but more importantly, and this is why I'm saying that maybe that plot on the first slide was a little bit misleading, the overall activity rate increased significantly. So what we saw was activity, relative to last quarter, we saw a lot more activity, and the tenor of that activity increased slightly, and that's a positive move. The deeper challenge around these numbers is that we're kind of, more or less very close to right now. The plot we're at right now is that circled October 2023 dot. We're very close to where we were last year. We're actually very close to where we were in overall kind of activity rate and tenor to the second quarter of 2020, which was kind of our pandemic panic corner. The challenge with that is it's hard to have a really, it's hard to have a really great sense or to be really optimistic about something like this, because even though, we did see a real improvement over the course of the quarter, right? An improvement in amount of activity, an improvement in the tenor of activity, the dots Q2 to Q3 did move in that northeast direction. We're at a level now where, when a very similar level of activity happened in the depths of the pandemic, there were Wall Street Journal articles running about how venture capital is, in a lot of trouble in doing these deals, and so many companies are getting marked down. It's hard to now celebrate that level of activity as something wonderful. So I would say that we are seeing venture activity that's rebounding, but has not fully rebounded, and is certainly not back to the kind of levels that we would have expected. The specific call-out dots there, October 2018, October 2019, that would be more typical for venture capital that we saw, maybe 2011 through 2019. So things got better over the quarter, but they're still not good. One of the things AngelList tracks with the thousands of deals going through the platform are valuations. And I like to think about valuations in terms of valuation quartiles. One of the most interesting things that has happened is that overall there has tended to be a pretty large pullback in terms of the pricing for Series A and Series B rounds, while the prices for seed and pre-seed rounds have remained stubbornly, persistently high. And I think there is a lot of uncertainty about, and we'll talk about this when we discuss kind of our predictions for the future, whether the continued strength of seed and pre-seed valuations is a temporary anomaly that will be corrected over time, or represents some kind of persistent change to the structure of how companies are started and funded. I think one of the intriguing things, just in this valuation data is that if you look at the medians here, you do see about a 2 or 2.5x step up in pre-money valuation between the various rounds, but that actually the the interquartile range tends to be almost about the same size, 2 to 2.5x, actually much larger for Series B. And so you see almost actually as much variance within a round as you do between rounds. So it's almost like we sort of have or one way of thinking of it, which is kind of consistent with the data, is that the idea of having kind of specific rounds at specific valuations has kind of been dramatically weakened, that what you see is kind of a continuum of deal prices, a continuum of valuations, and what's happening is kind of labels get applied to them specifically. But it is interesting that a quarter of Series A deals, the bottom quarter of Series A deals have almost the same price as the top quarter of seed deals. One thing that we do track consistently at AngelList is the funding to female founders. I think there was a little bit of concern with the venture downturn that some of the advances that female founders had made in startup funding immediately before and during the pandemic may be washed away. We are not seeing that in our data. The amount of funding to female-founded startups has remained relatively consistent kind of throughout the last year. One of the unique things about the third quarter, and this should not surprise anybody who has been plugged into startups, is the amount of money going to AI, ML startups. So this was the first quarter where AI ML startups were the most deals and most percent of capital deployed on the AngelList platform. I think when you look at a chart like this that displays, again, the kind of the purple is the percent of deals, the orange is the percent of capital deployed, the way to understand why those two bars would be different is something like this. If you have a lot of early startups, like actually startups being founded and raising their first round of capital, raising their seed or pre-seed, the capital allocated there is going on a per deal basis is going to be relatively low. And so when you see a large gap, when the percent of deals is much higher than the percent of capital deployed, it suggests that there's a pretty big new entrant or first round of funding that's contributing to those bars. On the other hand, what you see for something like Web3, where there's a lot more capital deployed than percent of deals, suggests that the companies, there are not many new Web3 startups, and that the Web3 companies raising money are more mature, and therefore on kind of a per deal basis have a much higher amount of capital being raised. I think that that idea does break down a little bit. What you'll see is that for what I would describe, the most capital-intensive startups, which would biotech, aerospace, hardware, you see that there's a lot higher percent of capital deployed than percent of deals. That's because those companies are presumably spending that money on real kind of physical equipment that actually costs money, and not just software engineering salaries or OpenAI subscriptions, as we'll get to. And with that in mind, I think that's kind of the natural segue to, as we're deploying this capital in startups into AI startups, one of the things I was really excited to partner with Ramp about is that they have the data about how those startups are actually spending the money that is being deployed into them on AngelList. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Ian to start discussing the quarterly data that they shared for this report.
Thank you so much, Abe. So right here, you can see average quarterly card spend by company stage. And I think one important thing to call out is companies really have three big buckets of spend. They have payroll, they have accounts payable, and then they have card spend. This is just the card spend portion. So there's a lot. And I think really what I'd sort of say, right, is a lot of these graphs are flat. And why this is important is a lot of the spend trends that we will show later are a little bit more mix shift in nature. The absolute size of the pie is remaining the same. All that to be said, we are seeing some pre-seed increases, which sort of says, hey, these companies are starting to get funded again. They are feeling comfortable spending money again. But you can see that for these later stage companies, spend has remained pretty constant, by quarter over the last couple of years. Next. Awesome. So advertising spend by company stage, I think, is really fascinating to me because it is sort of the single indicator we've seen that moves most closely with interest rates. This graph is by quarter. I can definitely tell you internally, we look at this stuff by month. And if you think about when the Fed first started to raise interest rates, this was in March and April of 2022, and that's sort of exactly what you can see here, is advertising spend comes down almost immediately. And as a data professional, I can definitely tell you, we think about this a lot and ask these questions as well. When our investors say, hey, let's pull back our payback period from a longer time horizon to a shorter time horizon, the math is really easy. And if you sort of think about all the parts of your business where you can cut back, we do see that advertising is sort of the first one to go. It is very easy if you spend $100,000 on Facebook last month to take that number down to $50,000 pretty quickly. Some of the things that are a little bit more lagging, for example, would be decisions around where to spend money on software contracts or hiring or office space or stuff like that. So this is definitely something where internally we had a lot of consternation when we saw, hey, all of these companies are pulling back on ad spend at the exact same time. I think in retrospect, we looked at it and said, this makes sense. To a large extent, we're asking a lot of similar questions. We do think that this is sort of the new normal. I do not think that companies are willing to underwrite, a 7-year payback for ad spend. The math is a lot easier to see. And so you sort of can see that this stuff has leveled out for the time being. I would guess that spending, 50% of your money on advertising pre-seed probably didn't make a ton of sense to begin with. And this is sort of what we are seeing for steady state right now. Next. Awesome. So I think this one is really interesting in two ways. I think it kind of tells a pair of stories, which are to what extent are people returning to travel post-pandemic, and also a little bit of to what extent are people returning to office post-pandemic. So you can see, of course, during the pandemic, travel's down quite a bit. People were not flying out for client meetings. They were not flying out for offsites. And of course, during this time period as well, a lot of formerly in-person offices started to become distributed. So within Ramp, we spend a lot of time thinking about this because obviously a company sort of travels for two reasons. One, to send their employees elsewhere to do deals, to shake hands, to make connections. And then also sort of the opposite of that, which is to bring remote employees back in person to get that in-person experience for an offsite, for an onsite, for things like that. So we do notice a lot that travel has remained consistent. That being said, sort of how the dollars have spent are changing a little bit. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in terms of our predictions, but the context around how a company spends dollars, why they spend dollars, and how they make decisions, that's definitely something that we're seeing change. Next. So here we have top merchants by spend. And the important part here, right, is that lumpy power law, big contracts make it to the top. So this is not saying everyone spends on these things. This is saying here are sort of, as you add up all the credit card transactions, the stuff that rises to the top. And I might be reading into this a little bit too much, but I actually like to think of this a little bit as sort of like a company's life cycle. And so if you look at pre-seed, some of the things you can see are Apple and G Suite. Maybe, for the first time, they're buying their employees computers. They're setting up all of their conference rooms. They're thinking about meetings, recurring meetings, emails, stuff like that. At the seed stage, maybe they have an office. They're furnishing it with Wayfair. They're buying some contracting work for the first time. And then I think notably at the later stage, that's sort of the first time that you see United, Delta, and American show up. They're having on-sites, they're having off-sites, they're flying out to meet companies, they're signing enterprise deals. All that to be said, if you look at really sort of the top 3 and 4, I think the truism that venture capital dollars are just sort of a 30 to 40% rake to Facebook ads, Google ads, and AWS, we do see that remaining true. In our companies on Ramp spend, we have not seen a way to get around paying Facebook ads, Google ads, AWS, and Amazon a lot of money. That's obviously pretty common knowledge, but I do sort of like to see how this changes by pre-seed, seed, and later stage as a company evolves through its life cycle. Next. Okay, so if the last graph was by dollars spent in a quarter, this is by prevalence. And it's a little bit confusing, but how I describe this is a measure of, has a business swiped their credit card for this service at least once in a quarter? So it's not really a conversation about amount, it's not really a conversation about usage, it's just a conversation about, do these companies use these things? And a couple of things that I'd call out here. Obviously, OpenAI had their keynote speech. They've been going into enterprise a lot. It's already here. We can already see that this company that really did not exist much in the enterprise space a year or two ago has fully cracked the top 10 across pre-seed, seed, and later stage. Developers are using it. It's coming out of company budgets the exact same way that GitHub is. OpenAI is part of the tech stack right now. And then I think another piece that's interesting to me here, and actually I think another one of the panelists, Rex Salisbury, talked about this on Twitter, which is sort of where I got this from. You can see LinkedIn ads is at the top here. Why I think this is a little bit interesting is if you think about the last slide, it was Facebook ads and Google ads driving really sort of that dollar-denominated outcome. When I think about spending money on Ramp, when I think about spending money at past more B2C roles I've worked for, certainly Facebook and Google ads are great places to deploy dollars, but there's a lot of competitive space. You can spend money on TikTok. You can spend money all over the place. I think the reality is, if you are a business and you are trying to put your business in front of other businesses, there is really no other network quite like LinkedIn ads to do that. And so that is why I think we see, whether it's pre-seed, seed, or later stage, all of these businesses do have prevalence and they are swiping their credit cards for LinkedIn ads. Next slide. Awesome. And of course, to the exact same extent that dollars are being deployed into AI companies, companies are spending money on these companies. One thing that I think is a little bit fascinating, right, is when you think about classic data science models, training the models, assembling the data sets, that might have been, computationally intensive. It might have cost a lot. But once you had them, inference was really, really cheap. And famously for large language models, that's actually not the case. If you think about these businesses, they have actually massive, variable costs and costs of goods sold. And why I think this is interesting is if you looked at this exact same graph by Web3, you would basically see nothing, which is to sort of say, you can found a Web3 business and not have to think about a path to profitability or a path to revenue that quickly. For these large language model companies, that's not the case because training is expensive, but also having them in operation is expensive. And so we have seen these companies have a path to revenue faster. One of the interesting questions, and I think we'll touch on more, is to what extent will there be vertical specialists versus just OpenAI kind of works better for everything? And I can definitely tell you, as a data professional, this is something that we've sort of been thinking about and wondering ourselves. Almost everything I know has sort of said, if you assemble a really specific set of data, hand label it, craft it, think a ton about industry context, your solution will do better than a generalized one. And I think what we've sort of seen consistently over the last year is for OpenAI, that's not the case. If you spend a ton of time just thinking about how to make your receipt matching better, OpenAI's just sort of generalized GPT-4 image detection might work better, even though it's not trained for that specific use case. And so that's kind of the narrative that I read in here, where certainly spend's going up. You can see OpenAI is capturing the majority of it. Next slide. Awesome. So this is startup formation by locale, and I think sort of similar to where we started. Not a lot has changed. Ramp, as you all know, is a little bit more of a New York City-centered network. So I do think this maybe skews a little bit towards our specific businesses as opposed to the whole. All this is to sort of say, while there was the pandemic and people moved and people came back, we still see sort of New York and San Francisco in the lead and everything else sort of flatline pacing behind it. And with that, I think that was largely what we had for you in terms of what we saw in Q3. And so would love to turn it over to Abe for our Q4 predictions.
Yeah, one of the exciting things about this session is that we wanted to take some time to discuss what we see happening in venture capital and startups in Q4 as well as in 2024. So with that in mind, Ian, what are your predictions for 2024 in startups and startup spend?
So for startup spend specifically, I think I see really two big trends. And I think one of them is in SaaS and one of them is in T&E. Within SaaS, I think today's finance professionals, those that are managing budgets, have been around the SaaS space for long enough to know that what you spend on a lot of these big companies in year one is not what you're going to spend in year two, and it's not what you're going to spend in year five. If you think about a lot of companies that have sort of famous net revenue retention, finance teams are now wise to this. So if you sign a $100,000 deal with Snowflake, they can really anticipate how that spend is going to grow in year two, year three, year four. And so what we've actually seen on a cohorted basis for Ramp is companies are actually consolidating the number of vendors they have. Vendors that are in, companies that are in sort of their fourth or fifth quarter on Ramp have fewer SaaS vendors than the companies that hit that, quarter four or quarter five last year. So I think one thing is going to be consolidation and really not just thinking about, hey, what's the first contract look like, but what is the second and the third. The other big thing I see is a lot more context added to travel and entertainment spend. And so if you think about kind of like what historic travel policies have looked like, it's been dollar denominated without a ton of intelligence. So for example, you can spend up to $800 on a flight, you can spend up to $500 on a hotel room. Other than that, figure it out. If it doesn't work, ask someone for an exception. What we have seen is that there's a lot more context behind that you need to think about as a business. And I'll just give you an example, just because I live in Boston and have been traveling to New York for once a month. There's some things I know now, which are do not travel to New York during the UN conference and do not travel to New York during Fashion Week. That is something where if a business has that context, they can make recommendations. Don't have a company offsite during Fashion Week or don't have a company offsite during the UN. That being said, there's other situations where you can't get around that. If you are a fashion business and the cost of doing business is having hotel rooms in New York during Fashion Week, having that context in advance. So I think businesses are going to think a lot more about how we think about spending money on travel. That's something we're already trying to empower business with, and we're already going to see it more.
Interesting. Yeah, from a venture investing perspective, our data tracks that the market peaked about February of last year. And I think one of the hardest things for me as a data person over the past year has been a better understanding of the way public markets and private markets are linked. So earlier this year, we did a blog post that showed a fairly strong continuous kind of correlation between public markets and private markets. Early stage venture markets by private markets lagged 9 to 20 months, which means realistically what we see in venture capital markets is what we saw in public markets between 3 and 7 quarters ago. And it makes me optimistic, but guardedly optimistic for what 2024 in venture is going to look like, because one of the worst quarters in the public markets was the first quarter of 2022. What's interesting about that lagged effect is that we are still experiencing and seeing effects of the fall in the NASDAQ in January 2022. We're still experiencing that in venture capital, even though I think people have largely forgotten that even sort of happened. We're still living through it in the venture capital markets, but our data does suggest that by the time we get to 2024, that will roll off. So if you think about kind of what's happened in the public markets over the relevant time frame of 3 to 7 quarters, I would describe it as choppy but generally positive. And so I think that that's going to be should be a generally positive trend for 2024 in venture. And I think the straightforward prediction would be sort of a return close to the pre-pandemic historical rates of venture activity. That said, I think there are 2 complications to that prediction. One is that I think we're going to see a number of startups that were founded in the pandemic shut down in 2024, and that will potentially artificially lower the percent of positive activity because we're going to see a lot of startup wind downs. The second thing is that if you were to make a bear case on venture returning to normal in 2024, it would be that, as I think our data has shown and Ian's data has shown, the market is kind of, the venture market is really kind of bifurcated. There are AI companies that are starting up and doing really exciting high valuation fundraisers, and then there's everybody else just kind of muddling through. And so if the AI, I'm not going to say it's a bubble, if the AI trend begins to contract in 2024, that would be another really negative trend for the overall state of the venture market, because in some sense, what we've observed over the past 6 months is that there isn't really a single venture market. There is an AI startup market, and then there's an everything else in venture market. So I think, Ian, one of the things that was most interesting in the slides you presented was around the relationship of interest rates to advertising spend. So I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit more about how interest rates and inflation affect startup spend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a fair amount of this is more going to be opinion than potentially fact. But thinking about leading a data team and thinking about sort of the decisions that we make over the course of months versus years, why I do think ad spend is really the most sensitive is I think that's part of the business that you can turn on and off really over the course of weeks. If your investors say, hey, we got to tighten the burn rate, that's the first thing to go. I think what we can see on sort of like a longer term basis is how willing are you to expand hiring? How willing are you to expand employee benefits? How willing are you to sign an office lease or a long-term deal? And I think all of those things have some relative level of lag to them. And I think basically I just sort of say, the equation that, talented growth analytics leaders and strategic finance leaders are doing on especially, B2C spend, where the math is really clear and the payback period, they have on the top of their head. If someone says, hey, this payback period is really tied to the cost of a dollar, that's the first thing that sort of goes up and down. So I think when interest rates go down, we will see companies feel a lot more comfortable extending those payback periods. They know the math really well. The investors will say, hey, you are under investing in this company right now if you don't start figuring out how to deploy more cash and grow effectively. So I think for me, ad dollars are probably sort of the number one area that you'd see people making, decisions very tightly linked to what their investors want, how they think about burn rate, and how they think about interest rates.
On the venture fund manager side, I think it's a little bit of a different attitude, and I think one of the reasons why is that whether interest rates are 0% or 3% or 7%, every VC is investing in companies that they think will grow much, much, much faster than that. Nobody is, I don't think there's a venture investment that you wouldn't make because it's like, oh, I'm not sure that company will grow, will be able to grow 7% a year. It's like, that's not a venture investment that would get made under any circumstances, regardless of interest rates. Where I think interest rates can affect GPs specifically are in a couple of places. One is that I think we may begin to see, depending on the persistence of interest rates, we may begin to see them reflected in the financial arrangements of the venture funds as they're formed. So you may begin to see more frequent hurdle rates. Oh, your fund has a 5% IRR hurdle rate because as an LP, I'm not going to pay you for inflation. Those hurdle rates were uncommon to very rare when interest rates were zero. I think we may begin to see them coming back into terms, especially as LPs maybe start having a real upper hand in the relationship between LPs and GPs. The other thing I think is interest rates effect for fund managers will be the use of capital call lines of credit. I think we heard yesterday from some of the panelists that a lot fewer people are making use of capital call lines of credit because They are rather expensive now. They directly respond and immediately respond to interest rates. In my opinion, the effect of a use of less capital lines of credit will be near-term IRR benchmarks for funds will go down, because I think one of the reasons that capital call lines of credit got so popular is that they did provide a kind of clever trick device to, some could argue, artificially raise a GP, fund manager's IRR for their fund, around the time they're raising for their next fund. And if those go away, I think when GPs maybe are forced to report kind of maybe more honest numbers for their actual IRR, not taking into account the capital call line of credit trick, I think LPs should get used to seeing much lower kind of benchmark returns for predecessor funds. Not just because the venture market's been sort of ice cold for investments made in the past 3 years, as I discussed yesterday, but also because there's not going to be as much of the crutch of capital call lines of credit. Ian, I think one of the most interesting parts, of course, we've talked about it in venture from the perspective of like the bifurcation of AI and everything else. I think you had some really interesting spend data on where spend is going. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where you think startup spend on AI is going in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, right, I'll probably answer this a little bit more from the context of a data professional who's having to make these decisions on my own SaaS stack and what tools we use. But I do think sort of that question around who's going to be able to do this best. Is it a startup? Is it OpenAI? Or is it an existing SaaS provider who incorporates AI into their stack? Will really kind of be the difference here. Just as an example, we had a vendor we used that did just receipt parsing. That was all they did. They were incredible at it. They spent a ton of time working on it. And we found that in many instances, OpenAI's GPT-4 just worked a little bit better. Not a company that had been trained with an express purpose of thinking about receipts. And so we pay OpenAI more now, and we pay that company a little bit less. When I think about other surface areas, for example, things like Zendesk and customer service, Salesforce and CRM systems, certainly they have some really smart people at those companies trying to think about how they can use their proprietary data moat and bring AI to the data sets they have to build a more compelling product. So I do think, based on what I've seen, I would bet a little bit more on OpenAI, and I would bet on the incumbents figuring out how to add AI to their products. That being said, I think certainly there are going to be a lot of very specific use cases, whether it's sort of like the picks and shovels of those building the models, or people who are solving specific issues that, for whatever reason, data set, context, regulatory, a more generalized approach doesn't work. But for the most sense, I would say I think companies are going to be spending a lot more on OpenAI in 2024. I think you're going to see a lot of people working hard to put AI into their core products.
I think it's interesting from the startup perspective as well. I think you're probably right. I think that consolidation or that increased spend on OpenAI will probably, what we did see and have seen is a flurry of new startups doing AI for specific application domains. And I think what you're saying is that, and I think I agree with, is that those are going to be pulled from sort of two sides. Like either existing providers can start adding AI to their products, or the OpenAI can just sort of do it themselves as part of their models. And my sense is that that's probably the correct perspective on what's going to happen in 2024. And a lot of the AI for X startups, unless there are interesting specifics about the application domain, may not be successful in competing against either entrenched folks or OpenAI itself. So I would expect to see fewer AI startups as a percentage started in the next year. I think we will probably have crossed the peak of AI startups. And in the time we have left, I think we have just under 10 minutes, so we'd like to go to some audience Q&A for the state of venture here. Let me pull this here. Question. While the report indicated venture performance trended upwards in Q3, it also noted that Q3 was still among the worst quarters ever measured on AngelList. As a founder, how should I interpret this data? Should I be hopeful? I think as a founder, it's always important to be hopeful. A friend once described to me that your hope is the greatest asset your company has as a startup founder, so please do not feel discouraged. That said, with where venture activity is at, it is, I would say, if you're not starting in an AI company, it is one of the hardest times to be fundraising at really any stage. I do think, and if I had to give a piece of advice to startup founders who are, either struggling to raise money or are unsure about the circumstance, frankly, I think there's a lot of room for seed and pre-seed valuations to fall. My guess is that they are going to fall from what we're seeing probably about 30%. And it may behoove you to consider looking at or accepting term sheets that are a lower valuation. And that could be a way to sort of bridge the fact that my sense is that as valuations get lower, activity will pick up and it'll be easier for positive activity to reemerge. So honestly, some advice that I would give a startup founder is don't lose hope, but consider taking 20 or 30% lower pre-money valuations. Another question, I think this is, Ian, for you and your perspective from Ramp. With more spending going into AI ML, which, if any, are the sectors that you think will see the most negative impact as a consequence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, none of what I'm going to say, I think, is sort of specific to Ramp. But when you think about AI ML, I think the big questions are, to what extent are you building out new surface areas versus automating existing ones? I think certainly headcount is probably going to be a big one. There are a lot of operational roles that potentially you would want to have work on higher leverage items. You don't necessarily want to have a massive customer service team that scales linearly with your business, to the extent that you can invest in AI and ML solutions for deflection, for automation, for process improvement. I think that might be an area, which is to sort of say investments in AI, ML will decrease sort of the manual operations that are necessary. And I can maybe give one example of this for ourselves. One of the ways that we build our price intelligence product is, to start, you look at 150 Salesforce contracts by hand in a room, and you sort of say, hey, what are the important parts of this Salesforce contract? And you can obviously sort of do that once, but it doesn't really scale. And you can't really look at every single Salesforce contract in perpetuity. But with something like OpenAI, with a lot of these other vendors, you can parse these documents at sort of under 3 cents per PDF, which is pretty tremendous, because then you can legitimately parse every single vendor contract you get and say, how can I express this in a JSON blob? How can I run medians and averages and percentiles on this to understand who's getting a good deal? All of that to sort of say, I think some of the AI spend will be to take existing operational costs and burdens and lower them. But I think to a large extent, it will empower companies to build new products and features and services that they can monetize that they never have before.
I think from a venture investing perspective, I think the sector that is going to see, I don't think this is a hard or radical prediction to make. I think the sector that's going to see the most pullback is going to be Web3 and blockchain. Already, we're seeing companies that sort of used to be blockchain companies and raised rounds as blockchain companies pivoting to become AI companies. The other sector, this is a little bit more of a flyer on that I think could see a pullback in investment activity, at least in terms of dollar amounts. And related to what you were talking about, actually, would be biotech. I'd be very interested to see if the AI technologies, large language models and stuff, as applied to biotech, could result in a lot more spend on computers and AI models, and a lot less comparatively very expensive spend on wet labs and scientists and stuff. So I do wonder if there could be, I think this is very unproven, but it was interesting to me, and I think something we'll love to see over the next few years is, what are the applications of these AI technologies to biotech and to biodata? And with that, that is the end of our session. I really want to thank Ian from Ramp for being here today, for making the trip out to our San Francisco headquarters. And I'd encourage everyone to please stay tuned. We have a really exciting day 2 of AngelList Confidential for you. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll hope you have a great rest of your day with us.